that's been forgotten by the human race. I'm not talking floods, I'm talking earthquakes, things falling from the sky, and who knows what else. It's not just stories, and this last global empire, whatever it was called, Irish, the Tartars, or the Confucian, or the Thieves, was destroyed and stolen by the Greeks/Romans. Then they conquered and cursed these nations forever by destroying their lands and rewriting their etymology. The word phony being derived from Phoenician is just one example. I have reason to assume that there was a great culture in America, and this will be further proven as we go on, but let's look at these maps again. I want to show you these mountains right by Salt Lake City, or where it's supposed to be.
Mainstream history, alternative histories like Atlantis, Lemuria, religious doctrines, the history of the occult and astrotheology, and the history of Rome and Christianity.
There's been a lot of hype around the Tartaria conspiracy lately, and naturally there's a lot of confusion surrounding it. This video is really an attempt to develop the theory further. So, let's type in Tartaria in Google and see what we find. If you look on Wikipedia, the first result, it will show you a map from the 1800s, 1806. Keep that in mind for later. Now on this map, Tartary is just an Asiatic landmass, with city names that are based off Mongolian or Chinese. And where we see Russia and China, this is where Great Tartaria once existed. Let me show you a map from the 1600s. Let's notice how this is much different. We see Great Tartaria. And let's also notice the etymology change of all the cities. It's no longer a Mongolian empire, it's something else, maybe pre-Russian? Also notice this, California is an island? Very interesting. Wikipedia's explanation is it's a messaging error. Considering how high of an art cartography was, I find that hard to believe. As far-fetched as the following information may seem, I'm going to ask you just to follow down this path. Some people are saying that Tartaria is some kind of distraction, but from what? And is this theory any more of a distraction than Netflix and video games? Do you honestly feel satisfied with the history they teach you in schools and churches? I understand that most of you are believers of evolution and Big Bang Theory, but let's just explore a very different alternative to conventional history. I don't know everything about the past. I wasn't there. Nobody was as far as we know. Science likes to think it has all the answers, yet scientists still can't tell us how consciousness came to be, the connection between consciousness and matter, and why the hell we're all here. My goal is just to get the message out there to those who are genuinely curious about what's going on in this life. It's an understatement to say that humanity is lost.
It's been pointed out by many historians that humanity is much older than we have been told. It's possible that civilization goes back millions of years, and we could be in some kind of cycle. What's clear is, advanced civilizations did exist in the past. If the monuments don't convince you, consider the myths and legends about gods having to deliver culture-important knowledge. There are hundreds of books written on Atlantis because it was a real place.
The first story we really hear of this is from Plato, and in Critias is telling Socrates a story. He says, "Look, Socrates, I got this crazy story that this wise sage named Solon told my great-grandfather, who was also named Critias. And my grandfather told me the story when I was 10. My grandfather started by saying how wise Solon was and that he was one of the wise 7 sages. And he, Grandfather Critias, was going to some poetry youth meetup. And there, Solon, his teacher, is trying to tell a story about the greatest achievement that the Athenians ever did. But he says, and which ought to have been the most famous, but through the lapse of time and the destruction of the actors, it has not come down to us." I thought Socrates was an Athenian. Socrates is hearing this story from a young man named Critias. Critias is relaying a story he was told at age 10 by his grandfather, who when he was young was told this story by Solon the sage. Confusing, right? Well, it's meant to be. So Solon is now starting the story saying basically, "Yes, we did something really great, but you don't know about it, young Critias, because these actors have been destroyed through a lapse of time." Okay, Solon continues telling Critias about a certain district in Egypt named Sais, and how they had a great connection with the Athenians at this time. So Solon was taking a trip there, and he was received with great honor, and he started a conversation with the priest of Egypt on past human antiquity, or basically ancient history. Now it says that Solon and none of the other Hellenes had nothing to say on the matter. And I think when Plato was writing this, he was implying that the priest didn't really want to talk about it that much. They were just listening to see what they knew. And at the end of the conversation, they didn't know anything, the Hellenes. They were clueless. So it goes on to say that on another occasion, Solon asked the priest again. And here is what I'm trying to show you guys. Solon was trying to pester the priest. It was like trying to show the priest his outstanding knowledge so the priest would talk about what they knew. Why? Because Solon knew that the Egyptian priests were much, much wiser. So Solon tried to impress them, talking about his knowledge of Pharaonius, who was called the first man, and about Niobe. Now I'm going to take a little break here because I want to show you something. What does this have to do with Tartaria? Well, let's look up Pharaonius and look up Niobe. This is basic Greek mythology, just the old gods, right? Let me remind you what we're talking about here. Solon is trying to tell the priest of Egypt, hey, this is my esoteric knowledge and how it pertains to ancient history. Plato is literally showing you in play format that Solon was one of the sages of the Greeks who knew the secrets of their mythology and how it pertains to ancient cultures. Niobe was the daughter of Tantalus, and according to Wikipedia, Tantalus was a Greek mythological figure most famous for his eternal punishment in Tartarus. I'm going to tell you what the secret of Pharaonius and Niobe is, but let's take this one step at a time. Let's continue. So Solon tells the priest, yeah, look, here's the secrets of Pharaonius and Niobe. And the Egyptian priest says,
O Solon, Solon, you Hellenes are never anything but children, and there is not an old man among you. Solon in return asked him what he meant. I meant to say, he replied, that in mine you are all young. There is no old opinion handed among you by ancient tradition, nor any science which is hoary with age, and I will tell you why. There have been, and will be again, many destructions of mankind, arising out of many causes. The greatest have been brought about by the agencies of fire and water, and other lesser ones by innumerable other causes. There is a story, which even you have preserved, that once upon a time, Phaethon, the son of Helios, having yoked the steeds in his father's chariot, because he was not able to drive them in the path of his father, burnt up all that was upon the earth, and himself was destroyed by a thunderbolt. Now this has the form of a myth, but really signifies a declination of the bodies moving in the heavens around the earth, and a great conflagration of things upon the earth, which recurs after long intervals. At such times, those who live upon the mountains and in dry, lofty places are more liable to destruction than those who dwell by rivers or on the seashore. And it's from this calamity the Nile, who is our never-failing Savior, delivers and preserves us. When, on the other hand, the gods purge the earth with a deluge of water, the survivors in your country are herdsmen and shepherds who dwell in the mountains. But those who, like you, live in cities are carried by the rivers into the sea. Whereas in this land, neither then nor at any time does the water come down from above on the fields, having always a tendency to come up from below, for which reason traditions have preserved here are the most ancient.
Notice how he's talking about two different cataclysmic events. He first is speaking about a myth that Solon's people have preserved, and then he states on the other hand, when the gods purged the earth with a deluge of water. So we know there's a distinction there. He said many destructions. The myth goes Phaethon, having yoked the steeds of his father's chariot, wasn't able to drive it in the path of his father. Could this mean that once Tartaria became a global empire and its motives didn't follow the same path as its predecessor Atlantis? And because he couldn't drive the path of the father, or remain as true as was the once great Atlantis, the chariot burnt up all that was on earth, and he himself, Tartaria, was destroyed by the thunderbolt. Could it be that Atlantis was destroyed because of natural progression through the ages, and perhaps Tartaria was destroyed for its evil motives, or its evil takeover? After the flood of Atlantis, this great nation tried to recreate Atlantis once again, only that it must have been forced so the civilization fell in cataclysm. The priest is saying, look, here, this tradition goes way back, and everything we know and all the science that we practice are ancient, very ancient. We preserved our sciences. He called the Greeks children, saying there was not one man among you. And remember, this is Plato, where we get all our sciences from. Now the priest said, the people who live on the mountains and dry and loft places were more liable to destruction when referring to Solon's myth. This is a very key factor. Okay, so that's the first understanding. There was an ancient advanced civilization in the past, and it was destroyed by water, and this is Atlantis. This is what we call pre-Diluvian, or pre-flood era. I want to start this off by just making sense of our timeline. If you're new to this stuff, then bear with me please, because I'm just going to explore out of our conventional timeline here. So we need to use certain terms and cultures to help us understand where we are before I can really make my final thesis. So we have this Egyptian priest, and he's talking about a pre-Diluvian age. So what was Solon talking about with the secrets of Pheronius and Niobe and how it relates to antiquity? While researching for this thesis, I had an inkling to look up the Gaelic etymology for Tartar. Let's see what it says. Gaelic, Tartar, a great noise or confusion, that which is noisy, bustle, uproar, confusion. A Tartarian is a slang, bad word for a thief. Then get this, it also says that the word is often accounted for by the story of an Irish soldier who in some eastern battle had called out that he had caught a Tartar, or a thief. This brings me to the Irish origins of civilization. We're told by authorized history that human civilization migrated east to west, but in this theory, a group from Atlantis survived and preserved the knowledge. Whether they knew the flood was coming, who knows for certain, but they landed in Ireland, and here somehow they survived. It's possible that this is the beginning of what we know as civilization, instead of east to west. I'm going to show you how the history of what we call the Irish, or the original inhabitants of Ireland, the preservers of the science of old, survived the flood, rebuilt their civilization, started traveling around the world to help the survivors, and bring their cultures back to civilization. Long later, those we know as the Greeks and Romans completely renamed these people, branded them as savages, and basically rewrote history for the masses, when we think Greek and Romans are the great civilizers of the world. The book, Irish Wisdom Preserved in Bible and Pyramids, by Conor McDarry, the audiobook is online. All you have to do is go give it a listen. Examine the evidence he presents and decide for yourself. In case you don't have enough time though, I'll try to break it down. Do you remember the Phoenicians? Yes, no, maybe? They conveniently skipped over them in high school, but they were a big deal. In mainstream history, their language was the basis of the Greek culture, and they sailed all over the coast of Africa, all the way to Britain. They were the sea explorers with advanced ship. However, when you look up in the history book, you'll get pictures of very primitive, unintelligent people. Baloney. Phoenician was a cover name, and you're going to see this happen a lot throughout history at the hands of the Greeks and the Romans. They simply renamed the Irish Phoenician, and they were all but forgotten. You can find more connections to the Celts to the Phoenicians based on their language here on the website simply called phoenicia.org.
Conor McDarry states, in their great missionary pilgrimage, they circled the globe in order to give religion and knowledge of God to the different races of mankind. They also established priesthoods and gave alphabets to the races who were unenlightened in such matters up until that time. Ireland is the country in which the arts and the sciences were first discovered and developed. In this country, the Greeks supplied the term oigia, a term which was never given to but the very ancient, and it's from the Irish, the Aryans, that the Greeks traced their descent.
In modern times, the term Aryan has been misused. It was never meant to be used for race. The Irish passed along the knowledge as spiritual guides, Arya meaning of higher class or status. This is where we get Indo-Aryan, where the Irish landed and must have shared this information with the Indus Valley culture. The evidence suggests that they were the spiritual teachers of the ancient world, after the flood. This is why all religions are based on astrotheology. You have some worship all over the world like the Maya, Aztec, Native American, Sumerian, Babylonian, Chinese, Japanese, Celtic, Turkish, and it goes on and on.
The term Arya is derived from Aries, the first sign of the zodiac, the ram. The symbolism of the ram is the knowledge of God, or the El. When Moses came down from Mount Sinai, he was horned, meaning that he had gained knowledge. Even Michelangelo represents this in his statue of Moses. The word pyramid, pyramid, means paternal power of the ram. In Egyptian culture, many pharaohs took on the name of Rama, or Ramses, to show their knowledge of God. In Christianity, it's been altered to be lamb instead of God, yet the symbolism of the ram and its meaning is deeply ingrained into nearly all world religions. Conor McDarry states, to the Irish Magi we owe the discovery of fire and the common grains which they developed from the grasses. They were the first people to practice agriculture. They invented the common tools of workmanship, which have come down to us practically unchanged from those ancient times. There's no mistaking the monuments left by the Irish, who were once the rulers and masters of the whole earth. Their rule embraced all countries. It was worldwide. Ireland was the first mistress of the seas, and it was the first and only worldwide empire which has ever been known, for it was a spiritual empire.
I'm going to dig deeper into Egypt now. And yes, I realize there's so many theories out there on who really were the inhabitants. I can't say I know for certain. All I can do is place the pieces I have found and gather feedback and more information. I'm sure there's more than meets the eye, but the info's out there. I know I'm not the only one interested in what really happened in humanity's past. From Gaelic etymology. Egypt signifies the land of Copt, or the Coptic land. Others derive it from and the yurt of black vulture. The color of the bird being, according to them, characteristic of the soil or of its inhabitants. Let's go back to the story of Critias in Egypt. So Solon is in Sais, and he's talking to one of the priests. Now, to make things a little clearer, let me explain. The sage and the civilization of Egypt at the time was most likely of a darker complexion. We don't know for certain, but it's apparent to me that Solon was light-skinned, or what we're told, Aryan, but he wasn't really now, was he? He was many generations after the first race of man that landed in Ireland after the flood and redistributed knowledge to mankind throughout the world. And that is what the priest was talking about. He was telling Solon about his people, the Irish, or the Chaldeans, Phoenicians, Babylonians, and of the many names they were called. According to the maps in the 1600s, the biggest empire was the Great Tartaria Empire. I'm not sure what culture this was. I'm not saying this is an Irish culture. I'm just bridging the gaps, so that we can understand why Tartar is associated with Irish etymology and how it came to be. In Greek mythology, Nile was a myth of Tartary and its destruction, and Solon thought that Pharaonius from Argos in Tartary was where man hence came. Pharaonius must be a king who had survived the Tartarian disaster and redistributed knowledge again, but this time east to west. This is why mainstream history we're taught this, because that is what the Greeks thought. That is what Plato wrote. Well, I'm going to take a guess and say that Plato was a made-up figure, but we'll get to that. The priest was unimpressed with Solon because the Hellenes, or the Greeks, stole all this knowledge. They had no preserved knowledge. They stole knowledge, renamed it, and took it for themselves. Not only that, but Solon didn't even know where his own people came from. The priest is referring to the West, in Europe, in Ireland, right after the flood, way before the empires of Great Tartaria. The Irish were responsible for preserving music, the secret of sound vibration, language, the occult, tarot, which the Jews turned into Kabbalah, advanced architecture, and stone megaliths, geometry, math, you name it, all the sciences. Astrotheology is the key. That is the answer why all spiritual religions have similar philosophies toward the material world. Civilization didn't just start randomly in the Middle East. Maybe with this alternative view, it can explain how similar traditions are present all around the world. Dances, fashion, spirituality, cooking, natural medicine, magic, and architecture. After some time, this became a global empire, with Great Tartaria established in the east, modern-day Russia. It isn't clear at this time whether Tartaria at its prime was controlled by Irish or had been hijacked, and that deliberate misuse of the great empire were rewarded with fire and thunder. If this is even close to true, is it possible that we may have missing time? I mean, after all, our calendar and time is based on astrology, and then finally determined and made law by the civilizers of society. It's really not crazy to assume that time has been constructed by these officials that took over the old empire, and I'm talking after flood. There's so much confusion because there's been multiple cataclysms on this earth, and that has been forgotten by the human race. I'm not talking floods, I'm talking earthquakes and things falling from the sky and who knows what else. It's not just stories. In this last global empire, whatever it was called, Irish, the Tartars, or the confusion, or the thieves, was destroyed and stolen by the Greeks/Romans. And they conquered and cursed these nations forever by destroying their lands and rewriting their etymology. The word phony being derived from Phoenician is just one example. I have reason to assume that there was a great culture in America, and this will be further proven as we go on, but let's look at these maps again. I want to show you these mountains right by Salt Lake City, or where it's supposed to be. Now, this is a lake that isn't here now. It's extremely large, and I can imagine that it was very beautiful. This was at the top of a mountain, and it must be pretty high in elevation. And so it flowed out the strait into the Pacific. And so Now remember what the priest said about these people who lived on the mountains. He said that they perished, and I'm about to tell you why. Because when the earthquakes come, and the comets come, and the floods come, they are the worst places to be. Because water flows down from extreme heights, mixes with the soil, and creates a massive river of solid mass. This is likely what occurred. Solon's myth, Pharaonius, was talking about the destruction of Tartary. There was some type of cataclysm, and it could have been all over the world. In Asia, North America, it was big. There's a lot of evidence to show that this happened literally in the 1800s. I know it sounds crazy, but what I'm about to say is insane, but trust me, and I'll walk you through it. To make it short, Tartary was destroyed somewhere between 300, 400 years ago. It could be longer, shorter, I don't know. But it was through some world-breaking event that caused earthquakes, mud floods all over the world, and this was due to some comet that was summoned through black magic by some evil group. This shook the world up, and people were down and distraught. And remember, this is not the flood of the Bible, this is after. And that is why this theory is so important right now. We truly need to be questioning who we are, what happened in our history, and what's going on here. Well, let's start with the Romans and the Jews. And please, if you're Roman or Jewish, don't take offense to this. I know for a fact that, nowadays, everybody has a really good heart, and it's kind of hard to really just terminalize it with just one word, but I'm sure you've done your research, and when we look into history and history gets dark, no other culture or race has been kicked out of more countries than the Jews from the history that we've been handed down. And there's a really dark history here, guys, and I can't really go into it in this channel, but it does explain so much. The Jews took the knowledge of the Irish, and they basically were a cult of the original knowledge of the Druids. That's the Kabbalah. It's the original tarot and the symbols that came from the Aryan priest of the global world empire after the flood. They took this knowledge, started practicing dark black magic, and basically through sacrifice and horrible religious ideologies, the ancient Jews warped and perverted the knowledge of the Irish. Now I don't know if black magic was used in the destruction of Tartary or not, but you tell me what happened. Tartaria could have been filled with peaceful people, because after the fight, they could have been easily subdued by the Roman soldiers. The Romans were the true Tartarians. They were the thieves. What we know as Tartaria has been a lie. The Romans and the Greeks named it using the language of the Gauls. Why? Well, we need to look into an important figure known as Josephus and how he influenced Rome. On Wikipedia, if you search Flavius Josephus, it says, during the First Jewish-Roman War, the Romans were battling the Jewish forces in Galilee. Now, Galilee is just one connection, even though it is in Israel. However, let's just reestablish this connection. So, what's happening? Before Christianity had begun, the Romans had their last and longest battle with the Druids. Well, the Druids were the Jews who hijacked the teachings of the Gomerites and stole it for their own perverted ways, became corrupt, and started sacrificing. That is why we hear about this happening in Carthage and Rome to please Jupiter. And this gets dark, but let's go on. The Gomerites were the Irish people, and this must have happened long after Tartary had been destroyed. So what is going on? All this knowledge that we have is just knowledge from the age after the catastrophe of Tartary, or the story of Tantalus, the father of Niobe. But here's the key to understanding this whole conspiracy. This was not Atlantis. I'm proving this through Plato. Plato could have been made up. It's entirely possible that the Greco-Roman civilizations never existed, and whatever empire was the culprit behind the deliberate destruction of Tartaria, or if it was just an accident, but whatever happened, someone rewrote history after this happened.
History is always written by the winners. When two cultures clash, the loser is obliterated, and the winner writes the history books. Books which glorify their own cause and disparage the conquered foe. As Napoleon once said, "What is history but a fable agreed upon?" Dan Brown, Da Vinci Code.
Let's recap. There was a flood, a deluge. The whole world went dark and was lost. The Irish civilization were the ones who preserved the knowledge from Atlantis. They distributed it throughout the world, and there was a worldwide global civilization. This is when Tartary existed. A group or empire or cult or whatever you want to call it, Rome, came to power through evil, black magic, with a plan to create a new world order. Cataclysm strikes all over the world. The greatest of all empires is destroyed, Great Tartaria, in which the Greeks wrote myths about. This evil group rises, takes over, history is rewritten, and all ancient history is systematically erased by these power-hungry peoples, whoever they were. All the remaining empires and people were forced to join or be killed. This gives me a better position to assert more theories. Now, if this is so, we need to establish some sort of timeline because what's going on? The first clue is in old 1600 maps. There's an I before the 600. Once you look into that, and then you look at the records of the Dust East India Company, they have the same thing. The best way I can explain this whole thing is that the 1600 ones are Spanish or European. They are all made from the European Union. And where did they get their source maps? Okay, I'm going to get theoretical, but I feel as if I have to start somewhere with really figuring out what happened. What we know is the Renaissance, the European Union, forming up their Rome from Germany and then to Spain, Britain, etc. It's a fabrication. It's well known these days that Shakespeare was just a character. How much more of our history is full of these fictional personas? And shoot, if he isn't real, then maybe we should all just stop acting like we know it all, because with all these unsolved mysteries in the world, it really goes to show how little we understand. Before Tartary was destroyed, remember, I said global. So they were in Europe, and that's why you see crazy architecture that all looks similar with unique varieties, but it's all the same idea, all over Asia and Europe and North America. All we know is the Greeks or Romans, if they even existed, were a people who walked into the cities of a once great nation and tried to scramble what they could from the remainders, and dominated the remaining victims of the cataclysm. One question that bothers me, and I would appreciate any input or ideas, is why were the remaining survivors of this great empire not be able to strike back? It must have been targeted, or something beyond belief happened that we can't really understand today with our modern minds. Now in part 2, I'm going to go in what happened with North America. Was there a great empire where the Grand Canyon was located? More proof for the mud flood with buildings underground and strange architectures in big cities. I know that was a lot of info, but we really felt compelled to try and bridge this Tartaria mystery with astrotheology and the story of Irish civilization. There's still a lot of interesting stuff that we didn't have time to mention, so stay tuned for more videos. Like and subscribe if you feel inclined. Until next time.
Release all that you think of as true.
Started out in a very different direction. I was researching early 20th century fiction and its connection to Little Season eschatology. However, seeing everything laid out revealed a possible timeline for the events that explain who we are and where we come from. We have so much evidence with the mud floods, orphan trains, the Industrial Revolution, political revolutions, missing history, scripture, you name it. Others have touched on it, but I've always wanted to combine it all into one simple unified theory. Hopefully this snowballs into something bigger and we finally reach a consensus. I've always been partial to the idea proposed by Madeline from Leaving Babylon, Jason Jack, and others that the Little Season began in 1776. It's actually frightening being only a month away from the 250-year anniversary, and I hope it's much later. People definitely aren't ready yet. But it seems reasonable that it would be somewhere around this time. Just keep in mind that this isn't like my usual videos dealing with current events where there's a paper trail to the corruption. This is a completely speculative opinion based on a comprehensive list of what little historical evidence we have. To be honest, I wouldn't be surprised if some of you already reached the same conclusion. It seems fairly obvious once you start looking into it. Feel free to dispute it, and if you have a better theory, definitely share it. Hopefully, all of us working together can figure this thing out. So let's do this chronologically. There were two types of people during the Millennial Kingdom. First, we have the glorified saints whose resurrected immortal bodies allowed them to reign with Christ for 1,000 years. Well, actually forever. They were given everlasting life. This includes the Old Testament saints who were resurrected at the second coming, the church age believers who were resurrected at the rapture, and the martyred tribulation believers who came to life and also reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. I believe this category of humans with glorified bodies to be giants, as evidenced by the buildings they left behind. They do not seem to suffer everyday bodily functions and earthly temptations. Don't get too excited, though, because they do not marry or reproduce, so we definitely don't descend from them. The rest were the mortal humans of the day and their offspring. Those who survived tribulation and gathered back to Israel, as well as the sheep from the sheep and goats judgment in Matthew 25:31-46. These mortal humans married, had children, and also died. Isaiah 65:20-25 shows that while things were certainly better, the sheep were still mortal, as were their offspring. You're probably thinking we descend from these people. Possibly, but there's so much more evidence that has led me to think that while these descendants might exist on the earth today, they are not our ancestors, at least not for the bulk of us. I even considered the possibility that those of us who can trace our ancestry way back might descend from these people while most of us hit a wall around 1800. But the problem with this is that genetically we are mostly all the same, and Revelation doesn't mention the extended lifespans of the mortals reverting back at the end of the 1,000 years. That and some of the Ancestry.com data going back that far might be completely fabricated. While most mortals living under the reign of Christ were still good, just like all of their ancestors who survived tribulation and entered the millennial kingdom, there is a lot of evidence that many were wicked, as everyone has free will, so it makes sense that some of them existed. Those are the ones Satan chose to manipulate and to do his bidding once loosed. The human heart is capable of rebellion unless transformed by God. They chose the path of instant gratification and were given top positions of power for this little season. Unfortunately, not much is written about the transition from the millennial kingdom to the little season, so we have to infer from what little information we have available. We do know those with glorified bodies went to the camp of the saints with Jesus. If they were still here, I think they would be fairly easy to spot. These mortal humans may have been mostly good, but the evil ones and their descendants are who I believe run all of man's institutions under the careful guidance of Satan today. When the glorified saints left and Satan was loosed, it's quite reasonable to assume he sought those who worshipped him during the millennial reign and proceeded to warp their minds to control them through their love of wealth and power to accomplish his goals, as we still see in today's leaders. They have been promised great riches, fame, and eternal life here on earth if they obey his wicked commands. And they actually believe his false prophecy. They readily admit it. In my first video, I referenced the Ring of Powers TV show. The second season is the best example I've seen describe the deception of Satan and how he wields it to power. Highly recommend any Christian who wishes to witness a first-hand experience to watch it. So, what happened to the good people? Well, evidence of the mud flood cataclysm is everywhere and seems to coincide with the end of the millennial reign and the many worldwide revolutions happening at the same time. Don't really think I need to go into too much detail on that. I assume you're all familiar with this event. Now, Satan does not have supernatural abilities. He can't invoke fire from above or cause worldwide floods. So how was everyone killed off, as we can see from historical evidence, population records, and mass graves under every city in Europe upon his loosing? While he may not have godlike abilities, he does possess the powers of manipulation and deception. It also makes sense that he would have the knowledge of other fallen angels like those who brought evil technologies to the people of Enoch's age. We've seen the pyramids. We know the Romans had the ability to level mountains. We know many ancient technologies far outpaced what we're able to accomplish even today. It makes sense that Satan trained and taught his early minions these ancient, wicked, and powerful techniques to wipe out the good people left over from the millennial reign. What isn't speculation is that the population of Europe was very low right before the start of the Industrial Revolution. Experts claim this die-off is partly due to the little ice age that just ended prior to the population boom. They say food would have been difficult to grow in this perpetual winter. But of course that's been debunked, as they could only show that it occurred in the North Atlantic, not all of the world, not even all of Europe. And at worst, the average annual temperatures were only half a degree cooler. Certainly not enough to have a dramatic effect on crops. Add to that the staggering number of mass graves all over Europe. This doesn't happen with natural deaths. Typically people have friends and family who properly place their remains in tombs, crypts, sarcophaguses, burial plots, not dumped by the millions into plague pits and catacombs. History, shockingly, has little to no information on what happened, and what they do tell us doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. What we do know is that millions of people all died in a very short period of time, and when the recovery to reconstruct was underway, the bones were collected into massive holes in the ground. And in the case of the catacombs, in quite an organized fashion. The idea of Satan's minions doing the killing still makes sense regardless of the method. The Roman mountain leveling technology, Runia Montium, explains the mud flood theory very well. The idea is that you drill tunnels into mountains near a dammed water source. When that water is released, it collapses the mountain and sends dirt, rock, and water down to lower elevations, destroying the mountains and leaving a lake of mud across the area. Sound familiar? Parts of these cities are still being dug out to this day. Another possibility, although other methods we aren't even aware of could have been used, depending on geography, is the old poisoning of the wells trick that has defined European history for centuries. Static in the Attic covered the book The Gods of Eden by William Branley in one of his videos earlier this year. It contains the testimonies of many towns, including the locals of Brandenburg, Germany, who witnessed 15 men dressed in black hooded cloaks spraying the wheat fields with long tools. What soon followed was a local population dying of disease that caused its victims to be covered in boils. Bramley also shows us that this exact same thing had been reported all over Europe. Sometimes these long tools were used just to knock on the doors of people, and soon after they fell ill and died with boils. These men in black hooded cloaks and masks carrying long-handled tools is where we get the image of death, although he's typically portrayed with a scythe. I guess that's what people from the era assumed this newfangled technology was, since they had no other frame of reference. Notice the gas masks reported by those throughout the history of European plagues? These people knew exactly what they were doing. The first biohazard suits. They even showed up in many towns and cities across Europe and posed as doctors. To no one's surprise, their patients got worse. Laws even had to be passed to prevent people of a certain religious persuasion from practicing medicine. There are virologists now admitting that viruses aren't even real. Even cancer research is proving that what they find in many tumors is parasites. Just look at the list of diseases that IM is shown to cure. It's parasites. It was always parasites, microscopic demons. And who has a long history of channeling demonic entities through sorcery? History shows us all these same tactics have been used in battle extensively. Chemical warfare has been around for a long time. These wicked people who survived the end of the millennial reign were given an education as soon as Satan was released from his chains and began recruiting them. So many Christians throughout history and right up through the present have been killed using these tactics. So Satan had now killed off most of the people who weren't loyal to his reign. I say most because there is a possibility that many Christians survived the floods, poisonings, and were able to spread the word, which would help explain why we have Christianity today. Of course, the more likely explanation is that there were so many Bibles around that they couldn't destroy them all, and we found the teachings of Christ that way. And this makes the most sense to me because why else would the Founding Fathers have lifespans that more than double the typical person of the day? Is it because they descend from millennial reign mortals with extended lifespans? Think about the super wealthy or those in top positions of power today and their long lifespans, which may be even longer than we're told. So, to create his dream society of technological advancement, money worship, and all-around debauchery, he needed a slave population. He rewarded those who served him in the beginning with positions of power and control, and their offspring still run the world today. It's no coincidence that some of the dumbest people alive are also the most powerful and have a strong lineage back to families with very dark histories, while most of us can't trace our family tree back more than 100 or 200 years. And this nepotism runs deep. These people who are involved in every type of satanic worship and occult ritual are obsessed with blood. They claim to descend from Shem and further down the line David and Charlemagne. King Charles actually claims to descend from Vlad the Impaler, which may actually be true depending on timeline. But we know that who they descend from are those that pledged their allegiance to Satan at the end of the millennial reign because they wanted control for a short wicked while. And they were deceived into believing Satan's army, like the sands of the seas, could actually defeat the camp of the saints. I bet they're even more convinced now that they have control of advanced military weaponry. Either way, they're also obsessed with rituals. Doesn't matter if it's Jewish mysticism, occult, Freemasonry, whatever, it's all the same. And it's no coincidence that every president is related to each other, and that lineage goes back to European kings. And the European kings are also related to the banking families that go back just as far. The rest of us are just slave labor for them. Alpha Talks did a video about the rest of the dead and cited the Book of Jasher about children being born in fields. Children were placed in the field and God said he would multiply them. They were reared by angels before being placed back in the homes of the original parents. Similar to Jesus' own loaves and fishes experience. God multiplied what was there. Gamers call it duping. Anyway, it showed imagery like Cabbage Patch Babies, and it's actually biblical, unless you don't consider Jasher biblical, but since it's referenced in scripture like Enoch, and we know who removed it, I call it inspired. Initially, I didn't think much of it. To be honest, it sounds very New Age, Mother Earth type stuff. But it got me thinking, if it's biblical, then maybe there's some truth to that. So I started digging into creating humans without sexual reproduction, and wouldn't you know it, there's a wealth of evidence, and to no one's surprise, it's a ritualistic part of every occultist satanic offshoot that you can think of. I'm not going to go into orphan trains, incubator babies, and Cabbage Patch Kids because it's already been covered to death. Except nobody that I've seen has done a deep dive onto who created them and why. If you know of anyone who has done research on this, let me know. On a side note, I do want to point out that the many pictures of babies in or on water, floating downstream, being birthed, so to speak, just more evidence for birth certificate, lost ship at sea fraud. But back on topic, they prove a point. We had a massive population boom of parentless children right at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Historians just say, how lucky for wickedness, and it's fascinating to me that it's a mainstream narrative to discuss millions of children running around the US and Europe without parents, and yet they don't provide convincing evidence on how they got there in the first place. London, Paris, Moscow, Dublin, Vienna, you name it, most European cities were stuffed with these children. The most popular explanation is just single mothers down on their luck sending their children off to be raised by the establishment. Makes sense. You know how mothers never fight for their kids and parents rarely get their acts together once they do have a child. Give me a break. The idea is idiotic. Maybe a handful, yes, but for most children to be given up for adoption is a ridiculous idea. In fact, they weren't even given up for adoption because there weren't enough families to handle all these children. You had two classes. Let's start with the rich, who cared for their own offspring. We know who these people were, the descendants of those who created the modern world under Satan's guidance. Then we have everyone else, broke slaves. They are unlikely to be descendants of the Millennial Kingdom because they are not only unaware of it and have no concept of who they are in the universe, but also because they have such drastically short lives. So where did they come from? Although this was true all over Europe, the US, and possibly elsewhere, the best documentation, whether real or forged, is from London in the late 1700s. They had these institutions called foundling hospitals and baby farms. These were massively successful businesses that dealt with orphan children, as they called them. The story goes that they took in babies and raised them up until the age of 5 or 6 before selling them to factories mostly, but also to do any type of labor, usually in the 10 to 12 hour a day range, but sometimes as much as 18. That's not employment. That's a level of slavery unimaginable. And it wasn't just locally. These kids were sold all over the world. And wouldn't you know it, the same wealthy people mentioned earlier already had a worldwide chattel slavery operation running at the same time. The infrastructure was already in place. But it wasn't just that they were sold into slavery at a young age. Most didn't even reach working age. The story is that 90% of them died in their first few years of life. It sounds like the most abusive puppy mill you can imagine. They literally didn't care if these kids lived or died because they could always make more. Not to say that humans weren't an important resource for them. Even today you can look around and see they need us to pave their roads, invent new technologies, cook their meals, build their buildings. At least the ones they haven't appropriated from the Millennial Kingdom. You know, grunt work, make their lives easy. This is not only well documented in books by Charles Dickens, poems by William Blake, but also in the writings of supposed activists and legislation to handle these child assets. Entrepreneurs and philanthropists like Jonas Hanway and Robert Owen describe cities and factories filled with children with no parents ever to be seen. It was like Neverland, if Neverland was a slave labor camp. And it was a slave labor camp on a level we can barely comprehend today, even though we're still slaves ourselves. I kid you not, the good people fighting for these children's rights believed that they shouldn't start work until they were 10 years old. Yeah, they were the good ones. Where this narrative starts to lose me is when they start fabricating little anecdotes about it. It's like those obviously fictitious stories they try to make the narrative of people like George Washington and Isaac Newton appear real. But in reality, they're exceptionally stupid and don't even make sense. Chopping down a cherry tree and not lying about it, or coming up with world-changing scientific theories because an apple fell on their head, are fables that most of us should feel insulted about. They don't even try. Well, there are a few of those regarding these stork babies as well. The first is that the mothers actually paid to give their children to these foundling hospitals to have them do the raising. They say it costs the mothers £5 each. £5 in the 1700s would have been enough to raise the kid yourself. It was the equivalent to a year's wages for a woman. If a mother has any hope, and £5 is a ton of hope, then she's going to keep the child most of the time. Could you imagine getting rid of your kid because you only had a year's salary in the bank? They also tell this romantic tale that the mother would leave a piece of cloth or a coin for future identification. Huh? How does that work? They had no record keeping or logs of these kids? Even if they didn't, wouldn't you leave your name? I can't imagine how a piece of cloth or a coin is going to help a kid find their biological parents one day. It's beyond ridiculous and destroys all credibility. So where the heck did these babies come from? So wouldn't you know it, every single pagan, occultic, satanic, Freemasonic religion has some form of belief and ritual for resurrecting or creating life through sorcery. Surmising where we came from is almost too easy. They don't hide it, at least not very well. And although there may be a slight variation in their religious beliefs, they are all satanic at their core. Helena Blavatsky, famed 19th century Russian witch, occultist, Gnostic, and Freemason, wrote The Secret Doctrine, in which she discussed various ancient human races, one of them being the Lemurian race, or third root race, who were born of pods or eggs. She took her inspiration from many texts, one of which is the Oralinda book, which claimed to be a 3,000-year-old manual written by the Frisians, an ancient Germanic people according to this group. I only mention her because she's highly sought after in the occultic community. These books also speak of people being physically born of the earth. More New Age-sounding Mother Earth imagery, but both books mirror Jasherin imagery and have a huge following in the occult world even today. To be fair, we don't even have to leave canon since God created Adam out of dust. Definitely a similar theme across many of these works, as all satanic offshoots derive from the original Jewish texts. Many of these books I mention are called forgeries by mainstream narrative and legitimate by many researchers. And the former may well be right, but since most of our history has been lost and replaced with very poorly developed stories, I'm inclined to believe that anything called a forgery simply fell through the cracks when they were trying to erase our past. The theme of creating life from non-living matter has been established in these Gnostic, Rosicrucian, Hermetic, occultic, Freemasonic, satanic texts. Let's be honest, they're all the same. They got their cue from the Old Testament, though, so let's dig into the application side of things. Paracelsus was a 16th century Swiss doctor and alchemist, heralded today as the father of toxicology. He also had strong religious views that put him at odds with the Catholic Church, but he was admired by the Rosicrucians. Interesting. As you would suspect, his work is also highly regarded among occultists and mystics. Of course, he believed in a female deity, which is in keeping with the Mother Earth theme. He believed that science and religion should be connected, and he's right, you find God in the details of science. But like the Hermetics, he wanted to try and connect with his God through sorcery. In his book, De Natura Rerum, he claims to have created homunculus, or artificial men in the laboratory. And these weren't even the first test tube babies. Remember the legend of Faust? Johann Georg Faust, also a 16th century alchemist? He lived shortly before Paracelsus and is known for making a deal with the devil and, among other things, gaining the ability to create a homunculus in a lab. Is that the plural? Homunculus? Homunculuses? Homunculi. Anyway, Faust is clearly the inspiration for Paracelsus and all other alchemists. Alchemy being the scientific arm of the occult. We could also talk about the Mandragora homunculus here, alchemically created from dirt and body fluids, but Paracelsus says they're just misidentified homunculus, so it's all the same. So it's documented that we have Satan worshippers before the little season even ends, creating human life in the name of their master. And we know that even to this day, the occult still practices these dark arts. It's very reasonable to assume that this was the breeding ground or early testing stages for the creation of a slave labor force of humans with no prior knowledge of the past to make us easier to control. Once you break away from the Old Testament, you get to the true foundational documents of the Jewish faith. And they all believe in resurrection when their Messiah returns. Of course, Christians also believe in resurrection, but that's divine intervention. We don't engage in the practice ourselves. That's occultic witchcraft. The Zohar, or Kabbalah Jewish Mysticism Handbook, is where they start breaking away from the standard biblical resurrection. And don't think of this as some obscure religion. You know those red bracelets that powerful people from all walks of life wear? Yeah, they're Kabbalah, and it's everywhere. And it's easy to see why. There hasn't been a period of the little season so far where it hasn't benefited their earthly desires. And Kabbalah is where we actually see practical application, although they don't go into specifics. They posit the Luz bone, a small almond-shaped bone in the spine containing their souls, can be used in ceremonies to resurrect the dead. Named Luz after the immortal city of Luz, indestructible and inconquerable. I was not able to find the ritual description, but luckily we were able to confirm it is still practiced thanks to the tunnels discovered under the world headquarters of the CL in Brooklyn. I'm sure you all remember the stained mattresses, baby carriages, and other creepy stuff down there. David Saltzman describes their practices so casually in this interview from There Goes the Neighborhood that it almost scares me.
David, if you could, explain why was there a mattress in the tunnels and what is this stain? A lot of folks are wondering, is this stain feces?
No, it's not feces.
What
The
is
stain is blood, and basically we did rituals. I said that before. There were some rituals that we do in the tunnels, and sometimes the rituals might involve someone who recently died, and we'll bring them down there, and we're trying to do a ritual to bring back the Messiah, which is a Schneerson.
So can you explain the rituals and why does it involve a mattress?
I don't want to go to the details of the rituals, but basically we don't put the body on the floor, we put the body on the mattress, and sometimes we might make an incision somewhere on the body, and a little bit of blood will come out.
So yeah, no big deal. It's not feces, just the blood of the corpses we use to resurrect people. No doubt this is still a major part of their religion. You can do a quick internet search to find out about the golems. There are so many books on the topic, too many to name for sure. But quickly, they are beings created by very spiritually evolved and educated rabbis. The Talmud even claims that Adam was originally created as a golem. So according to Jewish beliefs, only those who are close to God have the ability to summon these creatures. Rabbis have been claiming to animate life from inanimate matter using spells for centuries. They are described as being used for servant work, surprise, surprise. Eleazar of Worms, a German Jewish rabbi and mystic, wrote the first known text that actually gives clear instructions for creating a golem, which involves the use of virgin soil, ritual cleansing, a verbal ritual, so a spell, and final activation through the use of Hebrew characters or names. Mosh Idol's book Golem appears to be the standard academic text on the history and nature of these creatures. It details the magic used to conjure them with the use of permutations. As we know, Kabbalah is a very numbers-based mystic religion. In fact, if you remove Satanism from most variations of the Jewish religion, you have nothing left. In his commentary on Sefer Yetzirah, Rabbi Akiva wrote that you knead the virgin soil from the mountains with water to form a dough. Then you shape the body, head and limbs like a life-size gingerbread man with a letter on each of them. Then it starts getting complicated. A general permutation is done for each limb of each letter of the Hebrew alphabet with every other letter into letter pairs. Then you combine each letter of the alphabet with each vowel sound. This just forms the golem's body. In the second stage, you must combine each letter of the alphabet with each letter of the Tetragrammaton, their name for God, and pronounce each of the resulting letter pairs with every possible vowel sound. This is the activation spell process. Sounds crazy, right? But then why did they keep this practice for so many centuries if it didn't work? Let's break this down as simply as possible using the evidence at hand. Entire religions devoted to Satan who have run the world since the end of the millennial kingdom and still do today dedicated their efforts for centuries into creating life from non-living matter. Then, most of the population dies, and suddenly a new population appears out of nowhere with no legitimate explanation as to why. It seems they perfected the technology. This population was put into slave labor, which has evolved into the wage slaves that we are today, presumably as a way to keep us obedient so we don't revolt. Once they manufactured the slave labor force, the practice seems to have been lost and forgotten as their servants were and still are able to reproduce on their own. But they will soon be eliminating and replacing us with AI. This technology will do the same work, but probably much more efficiently and without any of the headaches associated with humans like sprawl, waste, government, brainwashing. We have to look at it from the perspective of the people who run the world. They are obsessed with AI. Every dollar possible has been diverted to this technology, and they can't stop talking about it in the news or government. Even though the technology is not and might not ever get there. But it will be so much easier for them. We were the original AI, humans created by a cultic ritual to be the slave labor for Satan's servants in this little season. But I don't think they're going to get to enjoy that life, because the end is approaching faster than they can develop this technology. On the other hand, none of this ends until Satan chooses to march on the camp of the saints, which could be an army of AI soldiers long after we're gone. Just like all the fictional fantasies tell us, we are the creation of our own demise. We are building our replacements. So, I propose that we are the descendants of conjured beings. Regardless, we're still the descendants of slaves created by Satan worshippers one way or the other. And it makes a lot of sense why they see us as subhuman. The Talmud actually tells them that we are to be treated like animals, and from their perspective, it's easy to see why. God bless us all into these final days. May our spirits stay stronger than the ever-increasing temptations that surround us. Little season theorists are correct, at least given the available evidence at this point in time. But for some reason, we aren't discussing the most important aspect, which is what that means for those of us living under the rule of Satan today. I get it, if we discuss how nearly every aspect of modern life is filled with satanic influence, we also offend everyone's sensibility and probably lose most of our subscribers. People want to have their cake and eat it too, even us little season theorists. We want to acknowledge all the wickedness around us, yet still participate in our corrupted government, banking, and school systems, not to mention the vain and hedonistic lifestyles brought about by modern leisure, entertainment, and social norms. But the truth of the matter is that if we're willing to admit evil runs the world, we also have to throw aside our pride, recognize that so much of modern life is awash with sin, and adjust our lifestyles to align with true Christian values, no matter how painful. This could lose us our friends, family, and financial stability, at least temporarily. But would you not agree that Christ is worth it? Most would argue that we are currently living in the best time to be alive. You know the lie that they've been trying to manipulate us with since birth? Things just get better every day. They equate worthless technology with the lie of evolution to try and convince us it's the best time to be alive. Well, it's definitely one of the worst times to be alive spiritually, and as we discover more and more every day, we aren't even as evolved technologically as our ancestors thousands of years ago. Our political leaders tell us everything is wonderful and amazing today, but early church fathers prayed for us because they knew this would be the absolute worst time to be alive. Augustine of Hippo wrote in The City of God, Book 20, that the little season would be the worst time to be alive. He knew he was living near the beginning of the millennial reign and claimed that when Satan is loosed, it will be extraordinarily difficult to escape the deception, and most will fail. And it's true, just look around. Nearly every single thing that every single person believes is a lie. Some say the worst part of life today is perpetual wars, violent crime, and a society of ungodly moral values. But they are just symptoms of the deception. Satan created a world in which the temptation to sin is extraordinary. He also says the persecutions will be amongst the most severe in history. with the faithful being tested to the utmost. And he's right, when the one world army that is like the sands of the seas is being assembled to fight Jesus, what do you think will happen to those of us who refuse to fight? Or worse, fight against them? Keep in mind that he was well aware of the brutal deaths of the disciples and followers like Polycarp and Irenaeus. And unlike previous persecutions, which were local, he said this would be worldwide. He translated Gog and Magog as representing all nations, the entire world. And that is true. We essentially have a one-world government today with the Prince of Darkness at the helm. If we are indeed nearing the end of the little season, then we have nothing but unimaginable pain to look forward to before final judgment. The good news is we know who wins the battle and who will be exposed in the final unmasking of evil. Tychonius, who influenced Augustine, also knew he was living in the millennial reign, and similarly feared for those living after Satan was unbound. And what he says stacks up with what we see today. He claimed that hypocrites would run the governments and the church would be overrun with evil and deception and eventually fall away, which is fully evident right now. We don't have many more writings from Tychonius. They've been lost or destroyed, but his followers reference his work regularly. I'd love to get my hands on a copy of his Commentary on the Apocalypse, but I'm sure the only copies of those are locked in a vault under the Vatican, and I just don't feel like navigating my way through a flurry of gay, pedophilic cocaine orgies to find them. And for those of us who want specific dates, Tychonius was adamant that both the millennial reign and little season are not a set number of years, just periods of time that begin and end whenever the events of Revelation come to pass. The deception that the early church fathers spoke of about the little season has led to the most devastating aspect: inadvertent sin. Satan sees the world as his soul harvesting factory, and it is because of deception. He has convinced the entire world through the use of 5 major institutions that sin is innocent, and when incorporated into everyday life as it is today, seems even more innocent. This causes a problem because participation is approval. In John 17:14-18, Jesus says we need to be in this world, but not of it. That means just because everyone else around us is participating in adultery, that we shouldn't do it. Not so difficult for your typical good Christian, but it also means we can't expand the money supply and sacrifice our children's inheritance to spend $90,000 on a new truck or SUV just to keep up with the Joneses, when a barely used Honda sedan will get us there where we need to go just as well, and probably more reliably, at 1/10 the price. So let's break down each category chronologically. Satan deceives and then rewards his most obedient victims. This basic concept, through the use of 5 modern-day institutions, is how he controls the world. When a child is born, his or her first experiences in the world are through their parents, who are already completely and thoroughly brainwashed. After that, we have the first category, medicine. To be honest, it's not really an industry that needs to exist anywhere near the level it does today. And for the most part, it's self-sustaining. In fact, healthcare is now the largest employer in almost every state. It's also not a coincidence that the increase has coincided with the increase in poison-filled long metal spikes injected into children. Shortly after birth, children are physically poisoned, causing numerous autoimmune disorders, cancers, mental disorders, allergies, you name it. This keeps us not only reliant on the system, but more importantly, functioning well below peak performance, which also makes us easier to control. Media and entertainment. Every mainstream book, TV show, movie, or social media company is designed to spread misinformation. Just like with every other category, all we have to do is look at the names of the people running these institutions. It's not a coincidence. People truly believe that entertainment and mainstream news sources are completely innocent, but they normalize all the lies most people think of as normal today. Believe it or not, casual sex, vanity, dollar worship, and self-centered ideologies are not innocent behaviors. But good luck trying to convince 99% of the population of that, mostly because they see it all day, every day, while interacting with media. Just look at space travel. We never thought twice about it as kids or young adults. But it's such an obvious fabrication, if you put any effort into investigating it, that they just start planting these seeds in our brains from a very young age, so we never do. And it literally applies to anything else, from the age of our world, to history, to Christ, to medicine, to government, you name it. Education. So then they send us to school. It's almost entirely misinformation or mental masturbation. I've cited this in much more detail in a previous video, but the same wicked individuals who enslaved us financially put us in a mental prison as well. Rockefeller, who turned a properly evolving medical industry into a pharmaceutical-based nightmare, one that actually made people sicker but rendered immense profits, also overturned our education system. The architect said Rockefeller told him to keep students busy and stupid. And he did, and we are. Believe it or not, children are not meant to be kept in seats all day while being taught lies, and then forced to become addicted to hardcore pharmaceuticals if they don't. Look at elementary education in some of the Nordic countries. Children are allowed to run around and play in the woods all day with a few breaks to return to the teacher for lessons. And guess what? They absolutely blow us away in academic excellence. To make matters worse, this is where the real indoctrination starts, because we are then rewarded for our obedience to the false narrative they teach. Think about it. In all your academic life, whether in grade school or college, were we ever rewarded for using our brains? For establishing critical thought and questioning things that are clearly false? No. Quite the opposite happened, didn't it? So from grade school through high school, we are rewarded for zipping our lips and pledging allegiance to lies. But that's when the real scam starts. College. It doesn't even have to be expensive. Let's be honest, if we had actual institutions that cared, they would provide a government-funded testing center, and students would only have to purchase some textbooks and take tests when they're ready, making a year of college cost less than $1,000, and students could live anywhere. For previous generations, it wasn't all bad. They could learn a few things, but more importantly, get some acknowledgement for it and start a career. And there were affordable schools so you didn't have to start your adult life strapped with debt. That all changed with the start of the Department of Education, which was a scheme perpetrated by colleges, banks, and politicians to make a fortune off of this career necessity. The cost of school relative to income skyrocketed when they joined up and started price-fixing tuition because it forced 18-year-old kids to get loans worth hundreds of thousands of dollars that legally couldn't be forgiven in bankruptcy court. I kid you not, an ambitious 18-year-old can't get a $10,000 business loan, but a $400,000 school loan? No problem. Now that's absolutely egregious in and of itself. But here's the real kicker. All we're learning is information that is completely free on the internet. And to add to the pain, it's not even a legitimate education. It's indoctrination. We're only learning half of what someone else who was self-taught would learn because we're only taught one side of every story or school of thought. We're only taught the narrative, the lies. And we're still left with the problem of success only going to the non-thinking obedience. That's not to say all college graduates are idiots. I'd like to think of myself as a notch or two above moron, but we didn't get those degrees through intelligence and meaningful thought experiments. We got them by shutting our mouths and regurgitating false narrative. It's no coincidence that so many successful people are college dropouts. Government and law. I don't think I need to tell you why the government and law is completely corrupt from the lowest municipal courts and legislators to the highest levels of the executive branch. So to keep with the chronological theme, we will just discuss jobs in general since our theoretical modern person has now graduated high school or college and is ready for full-time employment. Their obedience to deception will now render many financial rewards, furthering not only their own deception, but tricking others into believing that living sinful lifestyles is a noble goal. This is accomplished both in the private and government sectors. People who are physically capable of working a real job are literally stealing from taxpayers by working a government job. Legalized theft is still theft. I've spoken with a few people on this topic and received quite a bit of backlash. But I have to say that while they may not worship Satan outright, dedicating their careers to his service is a real close second. I guess it's possible to repent daily, but it's also just as easy to pivot into a career where they're actually providing a good or service to humanity. For the most part, people who avoid college and opt for manufacturing, farming, or the trades are able to avoid this trap. They work real jobs. They provide goods and services to the population. Not to say that college grads don't work in these fields, they most certainly do. But I'm focusing on liberal arts degrees here. For those people, their jobs are fake, literally. The people who print the money also have the ability to print fake jobs to keep the narrative alive. Everyone knows that government jobs are just a form of welfare. There's nothing they do that a computer couldn't 40 years ago, but the college scam falls apart if the graduates aren't given jobs.